should Sebastian and I hide ourselves?
It's up to you. I will hide you. I will force to
Okay.
hide you anyway. So okay, we're live on YouTube. So let me grab the link. Oops. I'm gonna type here.
I can just see Ben on the YouTube at the moment.
Oops, I think I somehow share the should be sharing this one. I'll drag this one out. Okay. We probably have 8 minutes to go. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, I posted the YouTube video. I'm gonna disable everyone now, okay?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Just on my computer, there's 17 seconds to go, and I will stop sharing, and you should show up as well.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, cool. You are live.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are. This time again, welcome to, I'm in Barcelona, and there's Anthony, Steed and another team in London. My name is Mel Slater. Today, before we start, I'd like to give thanks again to Sylvia Pan and Benjamin Congdon and Sebastian Friston, and the last two are going to be helping field the questionnaires. So today I'm very, very happy to introduce Professor Anthony Steed. He's in the Department of Computer Science at University College London, and he's head of the Virtual Environments and Computer Graphics Group. He obtained his PhD in virtual reality at the University of London. His research area is real-time interactive computer graphics with particular interest in virtual reality, augmented reality, novel forms of interaction, large-scale graphical models, and collaborative systems and networking for highly synchronous telecollaboration. I believe also he has I know he has a book in this area. He has around 300 highly cited publications in the XR and related areas, and he's been involved in many national and international research projects, both as leader and participator. He's active in technology transfer initiatives and industrial consultancies. He was founder and board member of ASIO Limited, which are the creators of the system called Chirp. So I'm very happy to introduce Anthony. He'll speak 45, 50 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards through chat, Q&A on Zoom, or through comments on YouTube. Thank you. Over to Anthony.
Thank you, Mel. And I'd just like to start by thanking Mel for being my PhD supervisor, because he forgot to mention that, or at least didn't say it. Thank you. So yes, I'm at University College London, and I thought I'd give a talk about technical challenges of mixed reality. This is the type of talk that you give after a sabbatical, and I just wanted to note that I did spend a year away last year, and I was hosted by Microsoft Research in Redmond, and then subsequently by Rob Lindemann and his lab at HIT Lab in Christchurch. And some of my thoughts here are really based on discussions that we had there at those places, trying to shape what I thought the challenges were for mixed reality going forward. So what I'll do is give a little bit of context to where the challenges and what we've been doing over the last 20 odd years, and then break it down into 5 areas where I'll give some examples of work that we've been doing and frame that within what I think we're going to be doing as a field for the next 10 years at least. And some of these challenges are 20-year, 30-year problems. So to start off with, Mel said I got my PhD in 1996. So obviously I started a few years earlier. And because of some of the discussion we've had over the last couple of seminars, I thought I'd start with a video. So
Anthony, you need to share your slides, I think.
Sorry, is it not going yet? Yeah. Sorry, it was going and then it stopped. Zoom interface go. Just this.
So it's at the bottom of the screen. You can see the share screen.
Sorry, I had arranged everything carefully.
Yeah.
And then it switched screens.
Yeah, it's good now.
Is that the full screen one?
Yep, yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So Yes, video. So this is where we were back in the early 90s. And to echo something that Carolina Krisnera said last week, if you look at the person wearing the head-mounted display, and it's obviously a big head-mounted display, but the form of the interface is very similar to what you'll see in the modern day. The person is fully immersed. This is a pretty wide field of view head-mounted display, actually. It's about 100-degree field of view. The resolution is quite small, but you can see that when the person is holding out their hand, there's hand trackers, head trackers, and this is one of the studies that we did on the virtual treadmill back in the early 90s. So the idea here is an idea which has been rediscovered several times, but the idea that you can walk on the spot and it recognizes your head tracking, from your head tracking, that you are walking on the spot, and then it moves you through the space. So the obvious thing here is that the form of the interface is very obviously similar to what we have. There's lots of wires here. We've just got rid of the wires, but the graphics is terrible. So this is not our first image generator. This is our second one, but you can see that you can explore all these things about self-representation, body schema. The person's making body-centered gestures here to make themselves smaller. And if I skip forward later on, you'll see the classic demonstration that practically every VR lab has, which is a pit, so that the person can look down, see their feet, and see the system, see the drop below their feet, and they become scared and have a response to this to some extent as if it's real. So the form of the display and the form of the user interaction we discovered a lot early on, and therefore some of the ideas that we're exploring in our research are still being resulting from this. For example, here you can see just about that the leg animation is automatic. So when the person walks, you see the legs flip. Modeling knees is quite hard, actually, because you need to know exactly how long the spine is, and that varies between people. But and you can still do research on that today if anybody wants to take that on as a student project and stuff. But so we have moved on, like as mentioned last again by Carolina and also by Mel. Head-mounted displays, that head-mounted display we have, the virtual research flight arm, it was very heavy. No question about it. We stopped using it and its successor that we had because it was a pain in the neck. Literally, it was sort of, you couldn't wear it for more than about 15 minutes, 20 minutes without, and you had to, with that you had to be careful swinging your head backwards and forwards because it was heavy. There's a large piece of optics in the front, which is itself quite heavy. So the optics is probably heavier than many head-mounted displays today. But as Mel said, we didn't give up on VR. We just moved to a different form. So this is a panoramic photograph of our current cave-like system at University College London. So you're inside a small room with 3 walls and a floor. You can see some graphics up in the ceiling, but actually what you're looking at is a mirror which is reflecting the walls. And because this is a panoramic photograph, you can see the 3 walls and also the fact that there's an opening. So we kept going with the virtual reality using this, and this is actually a study on crowd animation and people's response to crowds. And this kept us going until, obviously, until the last few years. The technical challenges of these displays, well, when we started off, this was just the big iron approach to computer graphics. The image generators for this were hundreds of thousands of dollars. But today this is driven off one NVIDIA graphics card that does all 4 walls at the same time. Now, it was clear in the late 2000s, early 2010s that something was changing. Computer graphics was becoming very much cheaper. Head-mounted displays weren't changing very much, but the image generators were getting very cheap. And it was clear that I was being driven by smartphones. So there was a confluence of the idea that we had these ideas about virtual reality, but now we had cheap platforms on one which we could speculate that we could build systems. So this is actually a very badly known, or very poor, not very well known virtual reality system that we built in our laboratory in about 2011 and was shown at trade shows at that time, which is based on an iPhone 3GS. And this smartphone had a quite capable mobile GPU in it, and it's driving a head-mounted display. So this is obviously around the same time as Oculus is starting to launch. Can't remember if the Kickstarter has started or not yet, but that head-mounted display you can see is actually a Sony head-mounted display from the late 90s, which is not very high resolution, but incredibly light, because a lot of the electronics is actually moved into a belt pack, which is the big block at the top of the screen, and it's connected directly to the smartphone, so it's sort of acting like a video terminal. So it is head tracked. The little box at the bottom is the head tracker, and you can see that there's a convergence here of we knew the head-mounted displays were capable. We knew that that was a potential to build one of these quite cheaply, and it was waiting for the graphics, the mobile graphics or the PC graphics to catch up. Now this system, the form of this system is quite interesting in that this is actually now, there is a proposed current commercial product that is also trying to run a head-mounted display off your smartphone. This one is not that capable, and I think the graphics only ran at about 30 Hertz. But again, it's just made out of things that we had in the lab. Of course, now we're sort of blessed with this type of device. So I have to say, in response to the progress, this is a remarkable system for the price, and I think this is actually quite a disruptive device. The Oculus Quest, it's wireless, it's portable, it's not the best system you can get. You can still spend thousands and thousands if you wish, but for the price that you have, we've come a very long way since 1992. So this is much more capable than the system that I showed in the first video. So what's the challenges then? We've got really good quality, cheap consumer devices, and one of the points of going on sabbatical was to ask, what is the big challenge? Because I would characterize a lot of what we've done at UCL as solving the engineering problems to try and realize high quality virtual reality. So we've done a variety of work from sort of avatars and graphics and networking. And as Mel listed at the beginning, me and my students and my group have published in a broad range of areas. And it has been the case of we've built a system and thought that's really bad. Can we improve that? And can we enable a new class of experience, or enable a better user experience by changing some of the engineering? And it still characterizes our work in that most of my students and staff, they build systems, they do some very low level work sometimes, which I'll go through some examples of later. But we try and make sure that we understand how this impacts user experience. And I'll therefore show, well, in describing these 5 challenges, a little bit of the theory, a little bit of the hardware and software that we're doing, and also point out some of the sort of impacts that this have on users, so we can see that the engineering changes that we're making are actually having a big impact on user experience. Now, I've tried to break it down into 5 areas, and there is a flow here. There's a story that links these 5 together, and I'll try and make those jumps as I go. But it's not to say that these are independent. That's going to be one of the points. You can't make an engineering decision about fidelity without potentially having to worry about social interaction and how it impacts that type of user's response to that system. And there's an obvious example there, which is we've known for 2 decades that one of the impacts of having a field of view on a head-mounted display, which is quite narrow, is that you find it harder to monitor what other people are doing in the virtual world, and this tends to mean that people don't think that you're contributing so much. So that's a direct impact of having a head-mounted display with a wider field of view, is it not only covers more of your vision, but it also makes it easier for you to observe and monitor what other people are doing in the virtual space. So let's break this down into these 5 challenges. And we'll start with fidelity, because fidelity is perhaps the obvious one, the obvious challenge. If you read the press about virtual reality, to some extent, it's a bit like the press about games consoles. One display is better than another one because it has some number which is higher. The screen resolution may be higher, the field of view may be higher, the frame rate may be higher. And it's very hard to judge which of those is more important. I have my own opinions and I'll leave those to questions if you wish. But to some extent, it's easy to measure progress in this. So the challenge about vision is perhaps the most obvious one. We know that head-mounted displays are not very high resolution. We know that humans have good resolution, at least in the fovea of the eye, so they can read very small text on pages, screens which are 4K, for example, and head-mounted displays just tend towards that. But of course, there's a tension because graphics cards at the moment aren't designed to drive 4K or 8K displays at the rates that we would like 120 hertz. But there's lots of challenges. There has been lots of progress. The head-mounted display that I showed you in the first video has an effective resolution of about 320 by 240 pixels in each eye, which is not a lot compared to the displays we have now, which may be 1400 pixels across. So those displays have got a lot better, and the optics has got slightly better as well. But there's still many, many challenges. And I picked on vision because it's the easiest one to describe. That we can see that we need higher apparent resolution. We know that we need wider field of view. We know we need better color, and we know we need this range. And we know that we need displays that can accommodate the eye, so that when something comes towards your head, you can adapt your focus to it, and this will be natural, similar to how you would do it in the real world. So all of these is a grand challenge on its own. There are head-mounted displays with much wider field of view, and there are high-resolution displays, but we're reaching the limit of what you can do with displays at the moment for the apparent resolution. So if you look at a prosumer or a professional head-mounted display like the Varho VR1, VR2, they're having to adapt to using multiple display panels. One which follows the eye around or will follow the eye around, and another one which covers the wide field of view. But let's focus on brightness. I mean, a really bright head-mounted display is dangerous. So you can't, when we say that we want to, this is an objective, that we want to create a higher dynamic range of display, then that seems obvious because the real world has many high dynamic range of brightness. But of course, if it's very bright, you don't want to have it against the eye for too long, because you'll get sun blindness, or at least your eyes will be affected. So there are challenges, lots of challenges here. I think I'll focus on pick one, and that this is an area which gets a lot of attention. That's the only point I want to make here, is that it's obvious. This is a prototype that Facebook were talking about, Facebook Reality Labs were talking about in September last year. It's called the Half Dome 3 prototype, and it's a display which I encourage you to read about if you're interested in head-mounted displays. But it's a practical form factor for a display which actually accommodates. So you can focus on different depths with this head-mounted display. And what you can see on the right is from their blog article below, with the link below, where on the right is the first prototype, on the left is the third prototype. And that could be fitted into a head-mounted display if it could be manufactured for the right price. And this would compensate as your eyes move around the display, it would compensate for the focal length over a very large range, and from what they report, it seems practically continuous focus. So that's really interesting. Lots of companies are tackling these specific problems or the specific challenge of the better displays, because if you can crack the vision, then you can have somebody wear a display for a very long period of time. And at the moment, with the fixed focus and the other factors of head-mounted displays that we would desperately like to get rid of, many people can't wear them for very long periods of time. Okay, but here's a piece of work that we did. I mean, those head-mounted displays are very high resolution, but actually the graphics cards haven't quite caught up. If you're going to generate a very high quality display and it appears to be at the resolution of your retina, the problem will be that you can't render the whole screen at the resolution required because there's just too many pixels to display. So there's a whole area of virtual reality or computer graphics that addresses virtual reality, which has picked up a lot of attention over the last 2 to 3 years, which is called foveated graphics. And this is a paper that Sebastian, Tobias, and I worked on for SIGGRAPH last year called Perceptual Rasterization, where we're looking at generating images for head-mounted displays, which actually take into account where we're looking. So I have cut out a few little bits of this video, hopefully emphasize just one aspect of it, which is if you look at the panel in the middle, this is the display that you would normally see. And if you looked in the center, if you're focused on it, this is roughly what your eye would see. This is a little bit of, there's some other factors to take into account, but if you look straight at the screen, this is not a rendering of what the screen shows, but what the graphics pixels that are sent to the screen. This is the only resolution we can achieve because we've rendered the image at uniform resolution across the screen. So what we introduce in this paper is a way of doing what we call cortical domain rendering, so that you actually do super resolution or higher resolution effectively in the bit the eye is looking at, which as you'll see if you zoom in and I pause it there. So the image on the left is roughly what we actually render. Then we distort it back to the display, and therefore when you look at the display, you'll see something on the right here in the via, where if you looked at the wheel, you just see something which is much more high quality rendering. Aliasing is a lot better, and so on. So that is a complementary technique towards a high resolution display. Is if you have these displays with fovea insets, then you can do a much better job of rendering to where you think the eye is looking. And that doesn't completely obviate the need for a multiple panels, so that you can show part of the screen at higher resolution than others, but at least allow you to make the graphics card work harder for you effectively, so that you can perceive the quality of perception inside the system is higher. And here's another video. And if you look up I've got all the links to these papers that I'll talk about at the end, so you're welcome to go and look at some more supplemental material. And we also solve another problem there in that paper, which is about how to compensate for the fact that displays don't update at the same time. So that we've been dealing over the years in several works with the fact that virtual reality systems are quite high latency, so from when you move to when the graphics appears. But you can do a lot if you know exactly how the screen is going to start showing you pixels. You can do a better job. So I focus a lot on the audio, the video, sorry, for describing some of the challenges. But I just want to briefly touch on the fact that actually this grand challenge of creating higher fidelity is a 20, 30-year challenge. Audio might be relatively well developed, but as soon as you touch haptics, you've got a very versatile set of sensory capabilities. It's very difficult to address for the whole body. And when I discuss it with the students, I usually talk about closing a door with your elbow, or pushing something with your knee, pushing the oven door shut with your knee. Now, if you're going to simulate those things, then you know the haptics is your whole body, and that's very, very difficult to address. And we occasionally see smell and taste interfaces. Smell is sort of easier to envisage, and there are devices that generate smells that you can use in virtual reality. Taste is very much in the research lab, but I just want to point out that there are others. This is a slide that I stole from one of my lectures I give to students, and it's one I came across many years ago. It's from the New Scientist, an issue of the New Scientist back in 2005. Because we started talking about senses and how many senses do you have, and then I asked them to estimate, because in high school you're told you have 5 senses, and here is this is a special issue of the magazine talking about senses, where if you have a conservative view of senses, you have 10 senses. Most people who study the medicine and the psychology agree on 21 senses, and if you have a radical view of sensory information, you do 33. Some of the more esoteric ones on here are obviously not really open to stimulation, such as blood pressure, stomach awareness, and so on. But of course, once you think about them, they are senses that you are aware of continuously. And of course, when we're talking about fidelity, some of these are unreachable in the sense that it would be dangerous or foolish to try and stimulate them. But you can see here, for example, that vision can be treated as 1, 2, or 4 senses. And since this slide was written, or the teaching was done, I've now found there's now much more evidence, for example, about humans with tetrachromacy, which is humans that actually have 4 types of cone cell in the eye, so they actually have a much wider sensing capability for color. And our head-mounted display is going to tackle that. Now, that's a sort of very very specific example, because there are actually very few people that have been identified that can have superior color vision using tetrachromacy. But you know, some of these senses are very hard, and some of them are fundamentally difficult, such as distorting balance and rotational acceleration and linear acceleration. These are in the realm of you can't break the laws of physics to do your virtual reality. And again, I've written about that again with Doug Bowman in the past, about the fact that walking interfaces can't induce momentum in people. So it isn't like walking. You're going to have to do balance platforms and so on. But it's a tough problem. So I've probably talked about all of those points there. Difficult, dangerous, or interrelated. So arguably all of these are combined together, so that, for example, vision might override taste. And there's a lot of work here which I would leave for future talks in this series about override of how other vision might override other senses, or conflict between senses, or the loss that you get when things conflict with each other. Okay, so the challenge for this one, to round that out, is that you build better displays, obviously, but we need to understand how humans sense information. Needs to do much more research on sensory mismatch, dominance of senses, and how the brain models discrepancies between senses. And the link here to the next challenge is that we need to better model the recipient. So we need to model the person. And this is something which we sort of know in mixed reality. We know that we need to model the person for 2 very obvious reasons. One is that the displays have to target us. We need to know where the eyes are and what the interpupillary distance is, for example, to better render. We need to know where the ears are to simulate where the order should be come from. But for example, something we don't do, which is sort of obvious if you think about haptics, we don't measure hand size, for example, to compensate for friction on objects and so on. So, and to lead on from that, that we also know from from the work Mel's done and others, that the self is a primary resource for interaction, in that we've known for a long time that there's something about seeing your body inside virtual reality which affects people's behavior, and that's been elucidated over the last few years about these ideas of illusions of body ownership that emphasize that we use the information received from the virtual world to interpret what our apparent body is. So while many VR systems use pre-modeled avatars, there's lots of applications, for example, of a current model of the user. So if I go into a virtual reality system, there's an obvious challenge, which is to try and reproduce me inside the system so that I can interact with the world and so on. So I can see my own avatar, an avatar which is me and looks like what I currently wear. Now, obviously that doesn't fit with many fiction or game scenarios, but there are obvious scenarios where it would work. So I want to emphasize the role of the body with something that sort of complements the things that have been mentioned in Mel's talk about understanding biases and so on. I don't know how well this will work on Zoom or on YouTube, but do humor me. So this is a task you can do on the screen, which is memorize the following pairs of letters. And this is essentially the protocol of an experiment I'm going to talk about. Okay, so you give you 10-15 seconds to memorize them. I've talked for long enough. And then I'm going to ask you a question which involves some geometric reasoning. Which of the two figures in the middle row are rotated versions of the upper row? Okay, so this is, give you 15 seconds for that. And then please answer the question. So just say it out loud. And now the hard bit, which is recall the letter pairs. So this is quite a hard task. Most people would only get about 3 or 6 of the letters correct out of those 8. It's supposed to be hard because the difficulty of the mental rotation task in the middle is supposed to interfere a little bit with your memory. So if you find the mental rotation task harder or easier, it may interfere with your memory. So this protocol comes from a paper in linguistics about the teaching of maths to children. And we can ask, so what happens with the avatar and in a virtual reality? And you can imagine, and it's hard to gesture to the camera for you, that if you're doing this task in the real world, or if you can see your hands in the virtual world, that you might make gestures. So for example, they might be mimic gestures where you're miming what you might do to the object, or you might be moving around to cover things up or point at things to help you memorize them. And this is possibly this is a typical virtual reality system when you can move your hands around and so on. So this is work I did with Pan Yi, one of my former postdocs. So in the real world, we know that if you give somebody a similar task, not exactly the same, but tell them they can't move their hands, they won't be as good at the task. So if you have a self-avatar, but you're told that you have to keep your hands still, we should expect there to be a difference because that's what the prior work in the real studies do. So hands on your knees here, keeping your hands on your thighs so that you can't move them. I just want to point out that when we did this experiment, if you are a VR practitioner and you have got a current system, on the hand trackers in this experiment were the same hand trackers in the first video I showed from the early 90s, because we needed a hand tracker that worked underneath a wooden table and therefore couldn't be seen by a camera. So we've done this a variety of times now, 3 or 4 times we've run this experiment with different high-end consumer virtual reality systems. And then we've used a 25-year-old still functioning magnetic tracker, which I just think is, I think is lovely because it shows that we've moved on, but in some areas we haven't moved on that far. But back to the main point, which is that the self-avatar, you're not allowed to move it. Okay, but what happens if you don't have an avatar? And what happens if you don't have an avatar, but you can move? So that you could move, but you wouldn't see it move. And the answer to all of those is that if you have an avatar and you can move it, you remember 28% more letter pairs. So if you look at the slide on the right, so the bar on the right in this chart, you'll see that there's not only a significant effect, but it's quite a pronounced effect, that if you have a self avatar and you're allowed to move it, then the person is better at the letter recall task. And if they don't have an avatar, if they can move their hands, even though they can gesture, and if you're thinking that you just need to gesture to help yourself think, then you're also quite not so good at recalling the letters. Okay, so that's a really interesting effect because it suggests that the body and getting a high quality avatar is not just important for the illusion of ownership of a body, but it's practically important for interaction and cognition, because you're using the body as a resource inside the world. But of course, making that work in a more general sense is very, very tricky. Getting the finger animations in is good, is helpful, and you know, there's many things to get in with to get the body there. But the link to the next challenge then is that as soon as we start showing these types of systems to people, then somebody usually wants to carry an object into the virtual reality. So the next part I'm going to talk about is transparency, the next challenge. And what I mean by transparency is a sort of reaction to Milgram's virtuality continuum. So everybody, lots of people cite the paper and uses this axis that suggests that there's a continuum between the real and the virtual. But I don't think the right-hand side of that picture exists in the sense that it at least bifurcates into a virtual reality where I'm there and a virtual reality where I'm some fantastic other creature, a lobster or something. And also concepts such as telepresence don't make sense. And I'd like to, my thought on this is that mixed reality systems, VR and AR, will need to model the world around us, and it's sort of a false dichotomy to set them up as opposites or competitors. If I have a virtual reality system, I want to model the world around us, the objects, the things in it, because I want to use them as a resource. I think the virtual reality should be opportunistic about using haptics, being aware of the space around us, as augmented reality systems are. So in augmented reality, it's taken as given almost that the graphics should fit with the real world and accommodate it. But of course, as soon as you can put an object into an augmented reality, you're going to want to alter the real world somehow. And I want to show one example, a piece of work which happened while I was at Microsoft last year, and I had the pleasure of trying this system from Jackie, and it called Dreamwalker. I think this is a really interesting demonstration, emphasizes the way in which virtual reality will model the real world. So this is a person, I think it's Jackie, but I couldn't be quite sure when I looked at it earlier, walking through the Microsoft campus, and they're seeing a pure virtual reality in the sense that this doesn't look like an augmented reality as you expect, but they're walking through a city. I think it's a simulation of a Manhattan-like building. So I tried this system. You put it on in one part of the campus and you walk through a virtual reality, which is dynamically changed to fit the real world. So as you see the crowds here, the crowds are there to sort of shepherd you to not walk into things in the real world, so that you stay on the path, you don't disappear into a bush, you stay away from traffic, and so on. So obviously it's very, very hard and very obvious if you were sort of making the streets exactly fit the campus, what's around you, but it emphasizes that you can take the real world and transform it. And you can see that in the future versions of this, you might, for example, start using benches or walls as real that are in the real world as in your virtual world as things you could suggest to sit on. And then you'll see in the research world around virtual reality, that people are experimenting with that type of thing. So transparency, to my mind, is just pointing out on the challenges that in most immersive systems model the real world to some extent. The purpose of safety, for example, and scanning and capture systems will become much more capable, much cheaper, and we can expect much more use of them in the future. So, for example, I'm sat at a desk and I've had my virtual reality system on. I want to recruit that into the experience, so I could have a virtual reality system that was laid out on my desk, much as if it was the virtual desk, and I have the tactile, the sort of passive haptics there to help me. And at this point, of course, as soon as you've started modeling the world around you, the environment, you're enabling a whole class of telepresence applications. So bringing other people in, using resources that are around me, and sharing them with others. But that's for another talk. I just wanted to mention one example of this, which is Ben's work, because Ben is helping with the questions afterwards. You're welcome to ask questions about this, in which case I'll defer them to Ben, which is a telepresence scenario. And what we've got is two people with two completely different rooms. So at the top line of this, you're seeing the room layout top down and a view of on the right of the person in the virtual reality. And on the bottom, you can see another person in their room, and the accessible regions are much, much different. But Ben's system is deforming these to match each other so that the people don't even know that the other person's not in an exactly similar room. And you can see that once our guardian systems in virtual reality or augmented reality are more sophisticated and more accurate at capturing the world around us, we'll be able to make this will become a lot more common in virtual reality systems in the future. So the challenge is to build a model of the world, and the object in it is a resource. These models need to be rich and detailed, they need to be functional, and the link to the next set of challenges is that we're going to need tools to work in the mixed reality. Okay, so the fourth area of challenge then is for mixed reality is tools to help us build mixed reality. And some of that has already been alluded to, which is that we can capture things around us. So that's become a very rapidly expanding area, but not everybody has the skill or the time to go out and scan everything. And we shouldn't just understand it as simply as we need better modeling tools, though lots of incredible work has been done there. And I can recommend to anybody that studies VR and augmented reality or modeling is to look at a game such as Dreams on PlayStation 4 and think about how you can make those types of tools even more accessible to the general public. So if we take a step back though and think about the real world, not a lot of us, not many people are actually making the objects around us. Many of them are just bought to fit. So we buy appliances, furniture, soft furnishings, and so on. We then may modify them, alter them, mark and write on them. We wear them down, we carve bits off them, we combine them and rewiring. And all of these things don't have good analogies yet in sort of virtual reality systems. Somebody might pull me up and say, yes, of course, in a virtual reality, we have the asset store in Unity. You can buy assets, you can put them in your world, but that's targeted at developers who are sophisticated. It's not targeted yet at the consumer that's wanting to make a virtual reality system their own. So they want to adapt it so they can work in it, or they want to make somewhere in virtual reality that they can do work. They're fed up with Zoom. They want to make a workspace, and we have ideas about what our ideal workspaces are. So we're going to need to modify them. Now, one thing I wanted to do here is this is a challenge that we don't have at UCL a huge amount of work in, but I wanted to highlight the work of my student Daniele, who's been doing something which I think is really lovely, which is how to make a tool. Well, he's making a tool which allows anybody to sort of populate an environment by sketching what they're interested in. So we'll watch this video from one of his recent papers. And what's happening is this is an application for populating a virtual environment. And what you do is you do a 3D sketch. So what you're doing here is, I'll hasten to call it programmer art, but you sketch a chair. So the person has a head-mounted display on, they have a wand, they are sketching in 3D. The metaphor for that is a bit like applications like Tilt Brush. And you can see it's very rapid. But behind the scenes, of course, there is a database where there are thousands of chairs. We know that they're really interesting models out there. And what this is, it's basically sketch as query. So we know that there's example chairs like this, that we say it's red and it's got a curvy back, but we don't want to have to type that in. There are plenty of red chairs in there. There are plenty of curvy chairs in there. But sketching is a tool which is very accessible. Most people can at least draw something crude that, for example, has 4 legs or 3 legs, or is an office chair, and then find things which are related. And Daniele's been working on this to emphasize, to pull out, make an iterative process so you can search for this database through a nice, easy gesture metaphor. And that's, I think, a really nice piece of work. Okay, the challenge there then, and this is one of the ones I'm only going to touch on briefly, is that there's an enormous amount of work to do here to make tools that embody knowledge about the function and purpose of objects when you're trying to construct. When we build applications at the moment, most of us fall back into Unity. We sit there with a blank scene and we go, right, I'm going to start with some geometry. I'm going to add some scripts to it. And then I'm going to make it function as I wish. But really, that's the wrong way around. We want to start with the function. We can say we're going to make a scene. It's going to have some tables and chairs in it. I don't want myself to have to implement the behavior of chairs go into tables, right? And you shouldn't, I don't have to set up the collision detection. I should be able to say that. And a system should be smart enough to pull all of those geometry and those rules out of a database. And I think we're getting there. There are some interesting projects out there that are looking at making the modeling of these virtual worlds much richer, so that it's easier to communicate to the system what you want. And I've put in here the link to the final challenge is communication, modeling and talking about models as being a communicative act, which of course leads to the whole challenge of sort of social interaction in mixed reality. And here, this is an area where I've spent a lot of time working, and I did write a book about this area, the technology about this area about 10 years ago. And at the time, having written a book, swore not to actually work on a software platform in this area because it was too difficult to get everything right at once. So I have inflicted on a few project students, master students, some ideas about this, about how to create flexible social virtual reality. And I think this is an area where we will be working much more in the next couple of years. And the point is that you can't really address any of the issues about how to build the space without addressing the security and the social structures that you want to support. So as many of us are, if we've got a foothold in this area, we've been out trying a lot of social VR systems. There are many technical problems that they have, such as the audio not working multi-party or something like that. Again, I can be very sympathetic with the platform authors because those issues remind me of my postdoc time. But as soon as you have a social system, then you have rules, you have groups, and you have intentions and groups to that you want to support. And I want to show you one more study that we've done that really emphasizes this, which is that as soon as one of the things that current social platforms vary a lot on is the avatar. And the avatar is often the very first thing you encounter in a social VR system. You choose between a social, something which is cartoony or realistic, and you get some choices. You can spend a long time there altering it, and then you have to go into the world and encounter everybody. But as soon as you make an avatar and make a choice, then people will use that avatar, to help them interact with the world. And again, this is work, again, another study done with Panier, which is, has avatar, social situation, you're solving puzzles, collaborating together as two people in two head-mounted displays. There's a lot to this study and the paper that's written up, because it is set up as something where we investigate the difference between collaborating and competing in this task. But the key thing I want to get across is, I think, a lovely observation, which I would spend a lot of time following up if I had the time, which is that there's a lot of body language in the real world when you do this. These two people are obviously collaborating to solve the task. These two people are obviously competing to solve the task. And it's obvious from their body language. One is shielding information from the other, whereby giving her back to the other person. And in other talks, when I talk more about social VR, I could talk for 10 minutes about this slide, because I just think there's so many lovely things about what's gone on in this task. The point I want to make, though, is with the avatar, that the decision is not neutral to the performance of this task. So in this screenshot here from one of the trials, what you can see is one of the people on the head-mounted display doing the task with that avatar and blocking the view of somebody else. And that's a really interesting emergent phenomena. And as soon as you have an avatar and a CVE, you spend your whole time trying to think about how people interact with these systems, what they're doing, what are they thinking. This person is using that avatar as a shield. And you can see that if it wasn't the same body shape, or it was cartoony, or it was partly transparent, you have to ask yourself whether or not they would have done the same thing. Maybe they've done it inadvertently, or maybe they've done it consciously because they know the person can't see through it. So supporting fluid communication in social VR involves rich representations, but also rich tools. And I would just don't want to say that there's any obvious routes here, but all of the 4 previous challenges impact on social interaction. And I think that this is perhaps, for me, I've finished with this one because it is the one I think motivates me to study virtual reality, is this social collaboration and supporting people working at a distance. So that's what I want to say, just to summarize, was that our ability to communicate needs tools to operate, as well as good fidelity, good representations of others. And we're going to need all of that together. So one of my frustrations with current social virtual reality tools is they're very good at meeting, but not creating. They often have very simple tools for creating, but people will want to build their own tools, build their own mechanisms to create. And all the way back to the sort of fidelity, field of view, and the avatar representation is important. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. So the summary to some extent is that today we have the systems we wanted to buy 30 years ago for 1/100th of the cost. We are currently in a paradigm that is focused on head and hand tracking and handheld input devices. And to some extent, that is very similar to what we had 30 years ago. But there's no argument that the systems are a lot better. There are lots of scope for new ideas, and there's lots of lovely work done out there at the moment. Things that really challenge us as researchers in the media space, good games, good experiences. So I would encourage my colleagues to do try a lot of this social virtual reality systems and some of the more creative content that's out there, because it is interesting how people are taking these ideas of tools and embodiment and exploiting the fact that tracking spaces are limited, or that you're using cartoony avatars, and they're using them to good effect. So they challenge some of these assumptions about what the direction of travel is for the research. Yes, and I've said some of this, and then what I wanted to say in the conclusion, my own belief is that social communication is the area where mixed reality will have the most impact. And I'll cut out the middle point because I talked about it on the last slide. I do think that there is something for everyone here. And this is a great challenge because it brings in everything from language design, computer architecture, through to cognitive and social evaluation. And that, I say thanks. And you can find more about our group's work at that URL. And I'll leave up until we get into the questions. These are the 5 papers I talked about, which are from our own lab. These are the 5 studies I talked about to illustrate some of these challenges.
Thanks, Anthony, for a fantastic talk and really interesting, and especially the early videos you showed took me back nearly 30 years, and I remember exactly those environments. I remember being in them. I remember the experiments. It was really great to see that. And as you said, although many things have changed, still a lot hasn't changed. I
am custodian of the group's videotapes. So every so often we get time to actually digitize one. So that is actually, that's a recent pull from a tape at higher quality than what we used to have.
Fantastic. We should have a virtual museum.
We should, yeah.
So questions should go ideally to Q&A, and there's already been some sent, so I'm going to go through them in order I've got them. So this is from Michaela Panakekova. Dear Anthony, thank you for an amazing talk. I have 2 questions. Have you tested any of the pass-through headsets on the market that can already mix VR and AR, such as HTC Vive Cosmos XR, Varjo XR1 or Lynx R1? And second, could you list some of the commercially accessible self-avatar VR creation tools?
Okay, yes, so I'm afraid COVID has put a stop to our experimenting with the Varjo XR1. It arrived about 2 days before we shut the lab. So it's one of those purchases which is languishing in a room at UCL, and it's frustrating we can't use it. But I have to say we did do some work on, we built our own video see-through head-mounted displays in the past. The work of Will Steptoe when he was a postdoc here at UCL, a system called the AR Rift, and which I updated for the as a sort of hobby project for the CV1 to add cameras. And we do have some work on using those pass-through systems. They are really interesting. I don't have anything summative to tell you about that. What we did with the systems we built is investigate people's inability to discriminate between real and virtual objects, leading them to treat virtual objects as if they were real. And at the time, because our system wasn't very high quality, we did that a little bit by cheating, by making the real world look less photorealistic. So there are some interesting effects there you can do, and I'm actually personally interested in that as a route for sort of augmented reality systems in the future. They are currently not very high resolution and very high power, but all of those things can go away over a 5-year period. Yes, so I have tried the XR1 myself, but we haven't had one in the lab yet. Commercially accessible self-avatar creation tools. So I'm afraid I don't know of a commercial one, apart from the one that Mel demonstrated in his talk. When we've done self-avatars, sometimes we've done the route that a few other people have used in the field, which is taking photographs and then mapping them to a commercial geometric avatar. We have done that. It's laborious and it's hard to argue that the quality is the same for each user. There are a couple of labs that if you were to email me afterwards, I can send you that they have built body scanners. So they are actively looking at experiments where they get the the person themselves into the system. There are a couple of labs there, but I don't know of a commercial one you could just buy now. There are various ones that'll take a snapshot of your face and stick that on the avatar. We've had a lot of fun with one of those recently. But that's a technology that comes from the games industry, because they've been doing that in PlayStation games for must be going on for a decade now, to texture map your face onto avatars. But I'm thinking more about the whole body, and I don't know of a system for that yet.
Thanks. A question from Daniel Salamanca. How far do you think we're going to get the VR experience straight to our brain and not mediated through our senses?
Okay, I'm not sure I can tackle that one. There has been a long theme of work about direct cortical implants and so on. I'm not a believer, basically because I think a lot of our experience is embodied. And if you were to put information straight into the brain, you still have to model everything the body would have done with it anyway, because a lot of processing doesn't happen in the brain, or at least our brain's response to it is moderated by what our body does. Just think of the latency in motor control, for example. Where does that come from? You'd have to model it all anyway. So I don't have a killer argument against it, but I just have a worry that it's a lot harder than certain people think it is. So I have to say that in certain areas, I think it'll move quite quickly, maybe retinal implants and so on, but that's not the whole picture when you're dealing with a body. And the study I showed about the being better or worse at remembering things because you can see these hands move around is part of my sort of vague argument against that. Yeah.
Thanks. So this is from Brian Waterfield. Industry are still not adopting. Why? Is it because there's no real plan to build a commonality that means it becomes familiar and seamless? With the current situation, do we, the tech, need to stand up and piece these developments together and create a roadmap? Okay,
so thanks, Brian. We've had a number of chats in the past about industry involvement, usually in the context of using complex displays. So yes, it's no doubt at the moment that getting your stuff into VR is unnecessarily hard. We've made some choices as a field, which is that VR is app-based, which I think are just wrong, actually. I used to think of virtual reality and a virtual reality headset much like I'm old enough to think about this in terms of, well, when we had the X window system on Unix workstations, didn't matter where the app was, I just send it to this display. And I used to think about virtual reality like that. And we have had a virtual reality platform that allows you to think about it. That if you wanted to build a tool for inspecting a piece of an engine, for example, you just import the tool because you had an app that did what you wanted. You wouldn't have to embed it all into one app. So I think there is a roadmap there from a software point of view, making things really accessible. Also, I'm a big fan of the social VR systems where the headset is optional. And there's one or two, I won't name them, which actually do a really interesting job about you can have presence at two devices at once where the VR headset is optional and you don't leave if you take it off, but you switch to another mode. And I'm really interested in that. You don't foreground the fact that you've got a headset. You make it, you sort of, it's useful when it's useful. And you can put it down most of the time. Because in Zoom, of course, we're all sat here and we're looking at the video some of the time. I've got 3 screens here. I'm looking at this one some of the time. I'm trying to remember to look up here because that's where the camera is. And we do that in meetings already. So the headset tends to exclude us from the other things that we might use. And there's another part, which we're looking at in a project, which is bringing in devices. So virtual reality at the moment, many of the systems exclude everything else. So I put on the headset and I don't have my phone with me. And I've got a little prototype I've been fiddling with in my spare time about, I'm bringing my phone into the VR system with me and using it as an input device. And we have done that in the past. I think that type of thing will make these systems more usable and more consumer friendly. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I would add actually that in Carolina Cruz Nair's talk the other day, she pointed out that virtual reality has been used significantly in industry behind the scenes for the last 30 years, and to some extent it's what kept things going. So
Brian runs the best cave in the UK, if you didn't know. So yes, he's on that, definitely. I think he's talking about permeation, sort of how much people are using. Yes, there's very high value applications. I'm completely behind, and I think Brian's completely behind Carolina's point there, that there are certain applications where the value at £1,000 is to build a state-of-the-art system is absolutely there, right? And this is the market that's driving things like Varho. There's people that need the quality, but you know, behind the scenes, there's 500 CAD engineers that aren't using it, or 1,000 people. And why aren't they using it? Because Brian and I have had that discussion, or I've had it with other people, that they are very highly trained to use a 2D screen, although they're doing a 3D task. So, and it may not be in the engineers that we need to look, but in a sort of sharing the uses and the communication around models. And as I said, I think fluid communication is the killer app for mixed reality. Thanks.
There's a question from Uni, who says, thanks for this thought-provoking talk, Anthony. Regarding the question of enhancing social communication in VR, is there a way to establish or communicate joint attention between users while performing a VR collaboration task?
Okay, that's a really interesting point, and it goes back a long way. So when we had one of the things we did when we had a cave is network it to other caves around Europe. It was one of the first things I did as a postdoc, and that was a lot of fun. And what you find, and there are papers back there, it's one of these things that Carolina would exhort people to go and look up, is that you get this sort of easy monitoring of what other people are doing. So we had a paper which is very qualitative in nature, but we had people interact for a whole day between two caves. And you could do that in a cave because the cave wasn't making people feel ill, unlike the head-mounted displays at the time. And what you see is directly to this point is that two people can go in there and they can do a task and they can decompose it and they can go away for half an hour and not interact with the other person. But they're monitoring what's going on, and it's not as if they're talking about it all the time. Are you still there? Are you still? So I think when you're embodied in the space and you have an avatar and you can move around and you can look quickly, you get a lot of things which are directly about monitoring and the attention of other people. You get it for free, and I think that is one of the things that I think we could make more of. I know various people have studied it now in social VR, but it's one of those key things. That's one of the things that motivates me to study this field.
Thanks. I'm going to move to look at some questions coming in on chat. And there's one from Agata Socchini. Do we still use a cave? And what are the advantages nowadays?
Okay. Yes, we still have a cave. As Mel pointed out, and as Carolina also put out, they have advantages and disadvantages. The main disadvantage these days is the amount of space they take up. The cost has gone down, but you still need a big space. They support groups. That's the biggest plus. As Carolina said, you can get a group in there. We still use ours, but mainly as demonstration space now. We do run experiments in it of a certain nature, but not as much as we used to. The head-mounted displays just mean that we're doing 5 times the number of experiments because we can just, they're easy to set up. We can give the students head-mounted displays. We already were lending them out so they could run their experiments, their studies in a wide range of spaces. Now, COVID-19 makes this a lot more question a lot more interesting. At a conference in VR, the main VR conference about 2 years ago, we had a panel that said, would you build a cave these days if you had the money? And would you maintain it? Are you maintaining your cave? And in a field full of VR experts, there was some umming and ahhing and going, it's expensive, it takes a lot of space, and probably not, actually. We wouldn't build a new one. We wouldn't invest a lot of money in refurbishing it if we had to. No, I'm on the proponent side. I think they are still really interesting questions. In the long run, I'm really interested in projectors. Projectors should cost no money in the future. They're solid state. They should be incredibly cheap. There's very little to them these days. When we were spending £100,000 on projectors 10 years ago, one of the things I explain when I teach this area is you can buy a bike light now, which is 1,000 lumen, which is ridiculous for a projector, already good for a projector. It costs £10, €10, 20 euros, something like that. So light generation, image generation isn't the problem now. And there are example systems there where you can imagine these being consumer systems, at least for some types of content in the future. But COVID makes it more interesting, as I said, because actually it's very, you still have to wear glasses in a cave, but they're hard plastic, no wires, they're not complicated, and they're easy to sterilize. So, well, I believe that we think they'll be easy to sterilize. So we may be using a lot more of ours because it's a safe system to use. And we can also, even if we don't want to wear the glasses, we can run it in monoscopic mode. So I think that's interesting. And you know, there is a good point to bringing in a group of people, which Carolina did mention, and I would emphasize that seeing somebody else in the world is really very straightforward for some applications. So that's why you do still see people invest in these large power walls and the caves in small numbers, because there is this pedagogical point, or it's just valuable enough to have 2 people or more people work in that space. And we've had industrial applications of ours, again, over the years, not too much because we're not really set up to do that. If you've been to our lab, it's very much a working lab with bits and pieces everywhere, robots and wires and trip hazards and so on. But we do have a lot of interest in using it for, say, architectural visualization or model visualization. Yeah.
Thanks very much. How are you doing, Anthony? You ready for more questions?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So into your hands, and it's about MS Dreamwalker. To what extent does the system model the real world? Is it specific to Microsoft Campus? Does it model other pedestrians?
Right. So the answer to so I would refer you to Jackie's paper with Eyal, Christian, and Andy Wilson at US, and the video is longer. I just took out I just showed you the first minute or so, and I did help a little bit with some of the things around the project. So I do know some technical detail, but I don't want to get anything wrong. It does, the model pre-exists. I believe in this case, for that experiment, the path existed as well. I know we talked a little bit about making it more general, but you follow a particular path in the world. The key points, though, are that you still have to track the person, you still have to track them moving around the world. So there are vision trackers on there which try and establish where you are, because GPS is not accurate enough to do that. So they're having to match the GPS and the vision tracking. And if you look later on in the video, you can see some of the techniques they did there. It is a self-contained system, so it has geometry in there. But for example, one of the really hard problems, if you go up to a corner and then turn, it's very important that you be tracked accurate enough in that direction, so that when you turn, you stay on the pavement, because you don't want to be directed into a flower bed on campus. Which is where it happened to be set on Microsoft Campus. So. It is about, the main reason for showing it is that it really is interesting that it's the first one I've seen that they're really trying to transform the geometry around you into a virtual reality. It's not an augmented reality. At least I'd be happy to argue that it's an augmented reality. You could call it diminished reality or replacement or substituted reality if you wanted to, but then you're really getting quite far off that axis that people use, I think. Which is the point about that axis, which is that it's not an axis. It's not a simple way of classifying systems.
Thanks very much. This is from Robert Bellerman. What's your opinion on the tools that have been used to visit virtual conferences like IEEE VR?
Okay, that's a really good question. It's very relevant. And I have to plug a little bit that Blair McIntyre, Rob Lindemann and I were going to run a conference. We ran a workshop at IEEE Virtual Reality, the premise of which was, let's assume that next year we're going to run a complementary VR conference. What would we like to do? And then, of course, Carl Johnson and his team put off an amazing job to do it in to run an online conference using with the support of the Mozilla Hubs team and so on. So to some extent, some of that is business as usual. Lots of things went wrong. Lots of technical things went wrong. It's a bit clunky, but I can't claim that we've ever built any software that's any better in the past. These things have been around for many years, and I'm amused by the anecdotes. And I think I mentioned this in the panel, that nobody thought about what happens when you take off a head-mounted display and you crumple, or you sort of suddenly see the person's head upside down. Do you report them to the local emergency service because they might have fallen over? They've just taken their head-mounted display off, and we used to have buttons for that. We're saying, I'm going to take my head-mounted display off, I can press a button and it sort of freezes. We used to have statue competitions for that. So there's a lot of promise there, though. The big thing that's happened is that you can now use standards for that. Hundreds of thousands of lines used to be coded in one platform I worked on just to make the media streaming work, not by me, but by others. So there is interesting standards there. I don't think anybody's got it right yet. There has to be a mix. There are some platforms that are really targeting conferences with virtual conference centers. And I think the thing that's got wrong a little bit is that most people will engage through the web. Because it's actually the most comfortable way of doing it for a long period of time. But then when I was in Mozilla Hubs walking around the conference, I did have corridor-like interactions with people I bumped into, and it did facilitate that. So I think that's the thing to focus on. And there will be a lot of experiment over the next few months about how to move between the two, and what's the role of live presentation, because now it seems that people are moving towards sort of flipped presentation. There'll be 15-minute videos and lots of discussion, but there's a lot of art to facilitating this discussion. I think there's an opportunity for a group or maybe even a commercial company to sort of really champion and do a good job of tools to moderate that. And again, that's one of the things that's come out of some of this prior work that we've done over the past 2 decades, is that when you build a social VR, it's not just about the front end. It's not just about what each other see. It's about the tools to stage that as well. There's almost a metaphor. It's like a theatre. There's a behind the scenes set of people as well. And even in Zoom calls, right? There's a team here, Sebastian, Ben, Sylvia, and so on, are working behind the scenes doing things to support the conference. And that, again, is something which hasn't been thought through too much in some of the social VR systems, that if I have a real meeting, then if I work with people I know, it can just run on its own. But I go to a lot of meetings where they're facilitated or somebody runs them and they want to have control over certain things. Maybe it's just the beamer where you show your slides and they moderate that, or maybe it's a microphone. But again, you'll find examples of that if you go back through the literature of people who've done a lot of meetings and then thought, we need better meeting tools, right? We need things to make this work for longer, for more purposes, because we need people to have differentiated roles. And we might have somebody whose sole role is to sit in the background, reconnecting people audio. So when I go into a VR system now, we're doing this as my team quite a lot. We're going to everybody's different platforms and kicking the tires and seeing what works and what doesn't work. But if the audio doesn't work, the only thing we have to do at the moment is quit, restart, try again. But you know, if you were in that was a high value meeting, there should be somebody there. I should be able to phone up and go, look, I'm in this world. It's an island 1345. I can't hear. Can you sort it out? Right. So technical support for those is also a really interesting challenge, and it's something that somebody will sort out some tools for now. Because if I was setting up a conference now, and we are planning more conferences, would I decide to do it? It's really hard to consider doing a VR version of a conference now. It's time consuming. In our community, the VR community, we can countenance doing it because we've got students who are technically savvy. But if you went out into other fields, it's just too much of a challenge right now. Somebody needs to simplify it. Even if the simplification comes with a cost, I paid cost, right? Because conferences have budgets and meetings can have budgets and so on.
Thanks. There's a question from Amanda Tristal Para. Please, could you talk a bit about what you see as the biggest potentialities and challenges for using VR as a tool for memory, providing new experiences from documents in archives or museums?
It's great. That's an interesting question. And it's one of the areas where there's been continual interest throughout the past 20 years, and people are really interested in a particular problem with museum context or heritage context. So sorry, could you leave the questions up rather than just delete them? So if it's more about museums, then obviously access is the big issue. So the VR lab at UCL, one of the VR labs at UCL is 2 doors down from the Petrie Museum, which is Egyptology and Assyrian, I think, museum. And what they've used virtual reality before. We have one of their demonstrations, which is they have these little statues. They're about this size, they're called Shabtis, and on the cave, obviously, they're human scale. And when they're human scale, you can see individual carving marks and so on. So that's really interesting. That's access, accessibility. It's a sort of almost a cliched example that like many museums, they've got more in storage than they have on show. And their role is, for the expert, is access to the right materials. And some of that is really just knowing what they've got and allowing people to see the parts of the collection that aren't there. Obviously, scanning is another whole area. I have my colleague Tim Vyrick in the group that's really interested in that area, making the tools available so you can have these artifacts on show or at least available in collections. My own interest is more about communication again. We've worked on a few examples over the years of people visiting museums virtually. That's both for accessibility, that one person is going and the other people can't access, and also to facilitate new types of experience, such as going around a museum with the curator. And I just highlight, for example, one of the things that we did when I was in New Zealand with Rob Lindeman's lab at the HIT lab in Christchurch is I did a bit of teaching. The coursework was make a virtual museum, and the students did great sort of experiences that both augment the museum, so to make better exhibits, but also then transfer some of the experience to online, because it was, if I recall correctly, it's one of the original huts. They have the artifacts from one of the original huts from one of the original Antarctic expeditions. And the artifacts have been taken out of storage, scanned, and have to go back into storage, or at least I think they're being returned to the Antarctic to go back into the hut. So there's also communication around those. So there's an opportunity there, but that is a temporary exhibit, I believe, and it will live on. At least elements will live on in virtual reality and still be accessible. So I think that is a really interesting role. Yeah, we've been touched on a variety of different things in that area. I'm happy to discuss that more over email or in some other forum. Thanks.
Thanks. So this is from Anna Carolina Kierov. Professor Anthony, thank you for the great talk. Given the increasing realism of the MR experiences and its interaction with the real world environment, considering that we can reach a point in which the virtual environment will be so close to the physical environment that it will be hard to distinguish between them, what would be the psychological impacts?
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and it sort of speaks to many things in the talk. I don't want to sound flippant, but there's a way of turning that around, which is what's the psychological impact of the real world, right? So if you can build things which are indistinguishable, then they'll have the same impact. So so Trip has, simple things like when we did the work on the video see-through augmented reality, one of the things we were looking at was the virtual objects become barriers, so people walk around them. So the psychological impact is sort of the same, but therefore, if you can imagine it could be easy. So the question is really, what does it facilitate the creation of? And if it's anything that's like in the real world, then it's indistinguishable. Then the question is back to sort of, can you create it in the real world, and therefore you could do it in the virtual world. And the virtual world affords many more capabilities, so things that transform their function, transform their appearance, are themselves relying on complex illusions and so on. So I think there's lots of creativity, lots of creative things to do that. Now, but I want to pick up on a specific point which is indistinguishable. And I'll just make the comparison to computer graphics, which is that in TV post-production now, you can't really tell if anything's real or fake anymore, right? So that's to the extent that when you look at the making of, you'd be surprised these days quite how much of what you see in the finished product is not at all, was computer generated. As soon as you make it interactive, all bets are off, right? So the next speaker in this series is Sylvia, and she'll talk about avatars, and the visual quality of avatars can be very high, but as soon as you interact with them, she may want to contradict me or argue against me on Thursday. It gets very difficult very quickly, and to the second that you won't fool anybody for more than seconds, unless you go for a cartoony appearance, and then you're trying to invest it more in a story, to more preparation and so on. So making something which is functionally a difficult the equivalent, I think, is very hard. So if I think just about the graphic, go back to the graphics, I can, another one of my students has just rejoined the lab day, or just shortly coming back to the lab, David Walton, is been looking at visual quality, making something look like it's in augmented reality, like it's really there, so that it reflects objects, but as soon as you put your hand through it, it's not functioning the same anymore, and actually argue from that point on about whether or not somebody will therefore treat it as real anymore, because they know that particular thing isn't actually real, and therefore they might have a different attitude towards it. So I think we'll get, I think there's many, it's a really interesting discussion point for the future. But the key thing will be, from an engineering point of view, is we can use that as a bar. We can make something look photorealistic. We make it look behaviorally quite authentic, but it won't be, right? It won't be functionally identical, because it won't have the same impact on the real world. And therefore, I'm not particularly motivated by photorealism. I think it's a good benchmark for other purposes. Like, if you can achieve photorealism, you can do other things. It's a good test of a rendering system, for example. It's a good test of a physics engine, but as soon as you've reached that, you'll probably not want to do that, because you want people to understand the role of the object in the same way. Now, yeah, I could carry on. I could give you examples the other way, which sort of argue that they should have the same psychological impact. For example, in Dreamwalker, you want those people that are stopping you from walking into the road you want to have the same impact that you wouldn't walk through them, right? But if somebody's tried that for a while and they know they're not virtual, that they're only virtual people, they're not real people, because they know how the system works, is it really going to stop them walking through? I mean, they have to learn that this is an indication that there could be traffic or trees or bins there, so don't walk there, right? Don't be silly. In which case, the function of those in people is very different, and very complex. So anyway, it's a fascinating question, and we're happy to get into it in a later time.
Thanks. Let's emphasize at this point that there's also the hashtag on Twitter, which is #FrontVR seminars, where you further questions at any time later, and people may be able to pick those up. I think there's just 3 more questions. Is that okay with you, Anthony?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly who they're from. How does Danielle's sketch query lookup work?
If Danielle, well, he's not here. I suppose he should be. She'll answer the question. So it's using in very briefly, and the full paper is in the notes at the end. I can happily share those links in Twitter in a few minutes. What you do is you sketch. It's using a CNN that does feature matching. So it's actually rendering the sketch to images, and it's doing a sort of standard sort of image search on a geometry database. Not standard, but it's using a variant of an image search on a database. And it works, right? So because even though those objects are not similar to the renderings of the object you would pull from the database, the search works still, which I think is the really fascinating bit. It sort of hints at what the CNN is doing, and the convolutional neural network is doing underneath the hood, is it is abstracting the interface, and it is really looking at occupancy of the screen. It's not looking at the texture detail and so on. And Daniel has gone on a lot further with that and tried to talk about sketch and voice. So that's what we're currently working on. How you might sketch and talk at the same time and find what you need. And again, that's his work. So I'll happily defer to him on Twitter or wherever. Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to comment on the avatars in Spatial I/O?
I could. I mean, we have tried it on Friday. So shortly after they released their beta version, we all piled in, my team, and it did work. And they're obviously recognized to be us. They're not. They could be better quality, but given that you're just using your webcam, this webcam, as you can probably tell from the fact I'm a little bit fuzzy, isn't the best quality. So the avatars are not brilliant, but they're functional. So you can see who I am, and they do little bits of facial animation when you're in there. So it works pretty effectively. There have been other platforms that have done something similar in the past. It does make it much easier to tell who's who, and you can see that fits their meeting context, because that is targeted more at small group meetings. I think it's really interesting system, and we need to get some more experience with it to see how it works as groups. Yeah, I mean, the key thing was it worked, and we could tell who is who without looking at the name tag, which is a problem in some other systems, especially ones that rely on name tags, because your avatar can look like anything. And it would frequently change. You can't even remember that this person looks like a cowboy, because by the next time you meet them, there might be somebody else. So we're constantly looking at name tags. And there is a particular problem, again, from the old CV stuff, or at least a persistent problem about telling who's speaking. And again, that works well if you know your team, because you can just tell from their voice. But in some situations, you'll be bringing somebody new in, or meeting some people, and if you go into these CVs and you can't tell who's speaking, it's amazingly hindering to the conversation. You spend a lot of time trying to figure out who's speaking. Of course, that happens on Zoom anyway, because you get enough speakers in a sequence, then it gets very confusing who's speaking, and that does rely a lot on the skill of the person that's running the meeting. Or a convention such as if you're speaking, you've got your video on. For example, which is in one series of meetings I'm running, and that's the convention. You can't, if you're going to speak, you have to have the video. You should have the video on. There's separate buttons in Zoom, so you just remember to click both of them.
Last one, I think, which is a good one to end on. What do you think about the end of mobile VR? I mean, Google not keeping the cardboard, Samsung dropping Gear VR. This is from Daniel Salamanca. They say that, I know it wasn't the best experience, but wasn't it a good start in VR for a lot of people? Or is it better just to have professional device experience?
Okay. My reaction to Gear Cardboard and Gear VR is complex. And for many in the field, they'll give you'll say it's not a simple thing. It was obviously great that it raised awareness, but it was quite a limiting experience. And to some extent, it reminded me of being back in the 90s. We were trying to persuade people what VR was, but then having people say, well, this thing you see on a desktop screen in stereo where you have to squint because it's red, green anaglyph was VR. They are qualitatively different experiences. If you have height, for example, I can't, you know, amongst the list of things that I would have thought would be a threshold for a consumer system is your height above the floor is really important. I think some of us, we sit around at conferences and talk about this a lot. I won't go on for too long, hopefully. They're saying it was a little bit too early. I mean, if only people had waited a couple of years until there were, you know, we'd had things which are a little bit more capable. Wouldn't it be great if we started with the Quest or something like that, rather than go through this 3DOF phase, a 3 degree of freedom phase, where you can only look around. Now, there are lots of great videos out there. I mean, it's sort of overlooked these days, but I spend a lot of really quality leisure time in looking at videos of places I've been, videos I've taken myself, videos other people have wanted to show me because of places they've been which I can't access. So nothing against 360 videos, they have their place, but it was sort of a little bit confusing, I think. I also think that the idea that you stick your phone in at something close to your face is a little off. As I said, the direction we went was a counter to some things other things that were going on in displays, which is, what have you had a second display you just plugged into your phone, which is that prototype I showed you right at the beginning. I really thought that would be the way that consumer head-mounted displays would go on, because you could use the phone as a handheld input device, right? So you wouldn't have to sell hand controllers. You could, you know, you get something with a 3DOF in it already, and I think those will converge, right? So somebody will start to think about that as a collection of devices your own, so that you will be recruiting your phone to be involved in your virtual reality experience. You can use it for certain, right? I mean, it's a very valuable tool. Why on earth isn't it in the VR? Can I not carry it in there? Why not? It's just got a separate screen. What's the difficult? You know, it's sort of somewhat paradoxical that, well, somewhat frustrating sometimes that we don't have access to them. So a little bit of me doesn't mourn it, the passing of them, because they were limited. I'm much more interested in the 6 degree of freedom, getting the whole body in there, having the right height, and so on. But it has to be said that who knows if this field would have taken off if it hadn't have had that awareness that lots of people could see something and go at least for 5 minutes. This is great. There's a trajectory here, which is interesting. So overall, I think it was a plus to the field, though I wouldn't have done it myself. But you know, it's a plus for the field that it raised awareness at an important time when a lot of people were skeptical about, you know, because they had memories of people saying that this thing was dead again.
So thanks very much, and thanks for a very excellent, informative session that people are going to be thinking about for a long time. And if we could clap, we should all clap. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Before we go, I'd like to say again, thanks to Sylvia Penn, Benjamin Congdon and Sebastian Friston for doing the question work, and Sylvia for doing the technical setup behind the scenes. To remind you that actually Wednesday is Doug Bowman, who's going to talk about augmented reality as the future of personal computing. This is all on the website. And Sylvia Penn, virtual characters from training to immersive gaming. So thanks everyone for attending, and see you again on Wednesday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.